In an older video, I covered Lithuania's main political parties. I mentioned that I wanted to explain the electoral system of the country, but that it was a little too complicated for me, especially because I wanted to visualize it and my skills in this department were limited. Well, I'm actually going to try and explain Lithuania's parliamentary elections process and system in this video. Okay, well, actually, I'm not explaining it. This guy is going to be explaining it. Džiugas Lapienis, a journalism student at Vilnius University and certified elections nerd, has offered to share his interest in the electoral system with me and the YouTube channel. It's more complicated than other systems around the world, but you know what? I think the system does a good job in representing the will of the people. So with that introduction out of the way, let's get started. Lithuanian parliament goes by the name Seimas. Seimas is currently comprised of 141 members who are elected by the voters of the country. As Džiugas explains, about half of these members are elected directly, while it's a little more complicated with the other half. Let's start with the first half of elected officials, who are voted in via the single-member constituency.
Think of it as two separate elections happening at once. When you come to your voting booth, to your polling station, on the day of the election, the first thing you get is this. So this is the single-member constituency ballot. So this depends from where you live. There are 70 constituencies in the area of Lithuania, and also one constituency for all of the voters voting from abroad, so the Lithuanian diaspora. And each constituency is roughly the same amount of voters. So on the first ballot, I don't know how well you can see, but here you just have people's names, and also on the side you also have the information about them. So whether they come from a party, which party they come from, or if they are independent. This system is pretty straightforward. It's just like first past the post, which I believe is what you have in Canada or what the UK has, but it's a bit different in the sense that we have a two-round system, meaning in order for a candidate to win a single member constituency, they must get more than 50% of the vote. So a plurality isn't enough, meaning if somebody gets the most votes in a constituency, but that number is like 40% of the voters who live in that constituency, that is not enough. So 2 weeks later, after the first initial election, we hold our second round of voting. In the second round, only the top two candidates face each other off, so somebody will get the majority because it's just two people, it's basic math. Let's say you have round number one and you go to single member districts, let's say Žirmūnai. You have a conservative candidate doing the best, and then one from the Freedom Party, from Laisvės Partija doing second, right? But because the first candidate, the best doing candidate got 37%, not 50% that is required, you have a second round 2 weeks later, and then you go to the same constituency and you see now it's 60%, 60.6 versus 33.6. I was checking earlier and I saw Alytus. See, the best performing candidate in round one got 17.5%. Comes the second round, and Vytautas Bakas, an independent, won that constituency, and Povilas Labukas, who was the leader in the first round, came second here. That's the pretty simple system of how we elect 71 members of parliament, the single-member districts.
That was the more straightforward and easier part to understand. The other half, known as the multi-member constituency, is where things get a little more complex.
But then, as you said, we also have the national ballot. And why do I say it's two elections? Well, because you get a second ballot the same day as round one of the single-member constituency. And this is where it gets a bit more complicated. So 70 MPs are elected via this method. On this ballot, the only thing you have is parties. It also it lists the party leaders, but that's not who you're electing. You're electing a party. And on election day, voters choose their most preferred party. Or you can also run as a coalition of parties. So this is usually done when there's two smaller parties that believe they would do better if they ran together. When the votes are counted, the first thing a party needs to do is pass the 5% threshold, or 7% if they're a coalition, of the votes that day, meaning of all of the people that voted, including the spoiled ballots, just basically take the turnout, and a party needs to pass the 5% threshold in order to be eligible to receive mandates this way. Once it is clear which parties have passed the 5% threshold, then we get into the math. As I said, the first thing a party needs to do is to pass the 5% threshold in order to be eligible to receive votes from the multi-member constituency ballot. In 2020, 6 parties passed the 5% threshold. This is the percentage of the total turnout, but when it comes to the math of how many MPs a party gets, that's not the most important part. So this is why I read percentage of threshold passers. So once you know which parties have passed the required threshold, you take the votes of only those parties, and then you see which percentage of this vote each party received. And then you do everything proportionally. So that you take this percentage right here, the 32.3, 22.6, or whatever, you take this percentage, and each party gets the equivalent percentage of those 70 that are allocated through the national multi-member ballot, and you divide those 70 seats proportionally. So this is what I did. If you see my Excel formula, which is very, very basic, I just took 70, which is the amount of MPs in the multi-member constituency in the multi-member ballot, and you simply multiply them by the percentage. So that's all you do. 70 times the percentage, it's 32.3% of 70 that gives you this number, 22.64. And then you round it up to 23. And you do the same for every single party. So you have 22% that went to the farmers and greens, 22.6 of 70 is 15.8, you round it up to 16, and this is how many mandates each party ends up with via the multi-member constituency ballot. But which people specifically receive those mandates? So this is where you have the second part of the national ballot. Over here, you have these 5 slots where each voter has the option to rank which candidates from the party they vote for they like best. So in each election, each party releases their list of candidates. They're all numbered. So when you vote for a party and you put up to 5 people into these slots, these numbers are counted, and you basically look at which candidates voters prefer the most. And then you take the popularity ranking, basically, and you make a new list going from 1 to the very end. Number 1 being the most popular candidate, number 2 being the second most popular candidate, and so on. And then what you do is you take the number of mandates that the party receives. So for the Conservatives, let's say it's 23. And you take the top 23 most popular candidates within that list, and that's who you award. Except it's not that simple. You have these 2 lists of numbers here. So this is priešrinkiminis numeris sąraše, which means the number each candidate had before the election, meaning basically that was their number when people were entering the number into these lots. And this is the new list right here on the left. So this is the list of how each candidate ranks based on their popularity.
Džiugas goes on to explain that candidates can be voted in through the single-member constituency, but their name will still appear on the candidate list for multi-member constituency voting. However, since getting voted in twice isn't exactly a thing, these single-member constituency candidates are excluded when it comes to choosing the elected officials through the multi-member system. So, using this 2020 results example, the politicians who are bolded are headed to Seimas through the multi-member constituency system, while the others are headed to Seimas because they won the vote directly through their district.
So the first such is Laurynas Kasčiūnas. He was not elected in a single member constituency, but he was 5th most popular overall, and he was the most popular candidate who hasn't won a single member seat himself. So we have Kasčiūnas, number 1. Majauskas, number 2, Razma, number 3, Ažubalis, number 4, and so on and so on and so on.
The bottom line is that you might not win the vote of your district, but you might still be elected to Seimas because you were high enough on your party's list to join via the multi-member vote.
Depending on how the MP was elected, the process of getting a new MP is either very simple or very difficult, right? So if they were elected via the multi-member ballot, then it's just a matter of getting the next person on the list. If they were elected via the single-member constituency, then a new election is to happen within that constituency. If it happens less than a year before the new election, that seat just remains vacant until the election.
Not all democracies function in the same way, and so it's clear that Lithuania's electoral system has a few more processes than others. In my home country of Canada, for example, you vote for your member of parliament. The candidate in that district, or riding, wins by having the most votes, even if it's less than 50%. The Prime Minister of Canada comes from the party that has the most members of parliament elected. I don't know if you spotted the major flaw in this process, but in case you didn't, let me explain. This system means that someone can represent you even if they don't have the majority of votes.
Even though 62% of voters did not want candidate B, this is the person who will represent them in the House of Commons.
This does not seem representative at all. Then when you consider that some districts have big populations and others have small populations, you realize that a small number of people in the right electoral district can heavily influence the outcome of an election. Džiugas explains that Lithuania's system works to address these issues, and it's thanks to the fact that the current electoral system was created more recently, giving the country the advantage of studying other systems around the world.
You get the Westminster system, which usually means 2 or 3 parties dominate, and then you get the proportional representation added to it, so it's a mixture of both, which allows for better representation, which I think is a positive thing. We have the positive of being a newly drafted democracy, meaning our laws and our system have been set up in modern times. They're not archaic.
After getting this explanation from Džiugas, another thought crossed my mind. If a candidate needs more than 50% of votes to win, and there can be a second round of voting, it must be more expensive to hold an election in Lithuania than compared to other places with simpler systems. Think about the extra days that employees need to be hired, and maybe the extra time people need to take off in order to vote again.
Oh yeah, that is actually a topic of debate. I'm pretty sure in 2000, there was no second round even. It was just round number 1, and that's it. And then it was basically the first past the post, no matter how much of the vote a candidate got. And that was because in order to save money, because again, the country wasn't doing well. They basically dumbed down the system, which made it less democratic, but more affordable.
So yeah, it's clear that to operate this more complex electoral system, it comes at a cost. But after learning about it and understanding it better, I'm convinced it does a better job at representing the will of voters. That's my opinion at least. Let me know what you think of all this. My many thanks to Džiugas for his efforts in explaining Lithuania's electoral system. A journalism student at Vilnius University, you can catch more of his work through Start FM, a radio station run by students of VU. If you live in Vilnius, you can listen by radio at 94.2 FM, or you can access it online at startfm.lt. And for the Lithuanian word of the day, let's go with rinkimai, which means election. Rinkimai. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Lithuanians are heading to the polls to vote for a new parliament. The ruling Social Democrats are fighting for survival after the election campaign was dominated by scandals and pledges to raise living standards. Opinion polls show the main parties neck and neck. The Prime Minister's leftists on 15% and the centrist Peasant and Greens Union on 14%.